When Charles Acland regained consciousness, he thought he was dreaming about a visit to the dentist. Certainly the numbness in his mouth suggested Novocaine, even if the rest of the fantasy was absurd. He was lying on his back, staring up at a moving ceiling, and a bell was ringing loudly behind him. An alarm? He tried to raise his head to see where it was, but a hand descended on his chest, and a woman's disembodied face loomed over him. The dentist? He watched her lips move, but couldn't make out what she was saying over the insistent clamour of the alarm. He toyed with asking her to turn it off, but doubted that Novocaine would allow his words to be understood. She wouldn't be able to hear him anyway. Somewhere at the back of his mind was a lurking fear that he didn't recognize. For no reason that he understood, the closeness of the woman worried him. He'd been in this position before, flat on his back and unable to move, and there was a strong association in his mind with pain. Fleetingly, another woman, slender, dark-haired and graceful, appeared in his line of vision. There were tears in her eyes, but Acland had no idea who she was. His instinctive reaction was dislike. His only points of reference were the alarm and the ceiling moving above his head. Nothing had any meaning for him. He could have floated forever in morphine-induced detachment if increasing awareness hadn't told him this wasn't a dream. He started to experience sensations. A jolt as the trolley crossed the threshold, the sympathetic tightening of stretcher straps as his body shifted, a low ache at the back of his jaw, a brief stabbing pain that knifed up his neck, a puzzled realization that only one of his eyes was open. With a sense of dread he knew he was awake, with no idea who he was, where he was, or what had happened to him. Subsequent awakenings increased his dread. He came to understand that the ringing was inside his head. It grew more bearable with each return to consciousness, but he couldn't hear what was said by the faces that stared down at him. Their mouths opened and closed, but nothing reached him, nor did he know if his own mouth was relaying the signals his brain was sending to it. He tried to speak of his fears, but the lack of response in the faces above him persuaded him his lips weren't moving. Time was meaningless. He couldn't tell how often he drifted in and out of consciousness, or how long his periods of sleep lasted. He convinced himself that days and weeks had passed since he'd been brought to this place, and a slow anger burned inside him as threads of insight began to knit together. Something cataclysmic had happened. He was in hospital. The talking heads were doctors, but they weren't helping him, and they couldn't see that he was awake. He had a terrifying anxiety that he was in the hands of enemies. Why? Or that he was trapped forever in a paralyzed state that allowed him to think and reason, but left him unable to communicate. The dark-haired woman suffocated him. He hated the smell of her and the touch of her hand on his skin. She was always there, weeping soft, round tears down her pale cheeks, but her sadness failed to move Acland. He knew intuitively that the tears were for show, not for him, and he despised her for her lack of sincerity.